Sorry. So once again, thanks everyone for being here tonight. For tonight's Science Club Talk, I am very excited to introduce Dr. Banu Subramaniam, Professor and Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, for her talk tonight called Decolonizing Botany. So originally trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist, Subramaniam's pioneering research in feminist science studies has made her a leader in the field. Her work explores the philosophy, history, and culture of the natural sciences and medicine as they relate to gender, race, ethnicity, and caste. Her latest research rethinks the field and practice of botany in relation to histories of colonialism and xenophobia, and explores the wide travels of scientific theories, ideas, and concepts as they relate to migration and invasive species. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Subramaniam, for being here today.
Thanks, Sarah, for inviting me. Given that this is a small group, it's a pity I can't see all your faces, and we can make this more informal. But I'm really fine if people want to ask questions during the session. If you chat, I'm happy to make this more informal than a formal talk. I'm going to share my screen, but otherwise I'll keep going if there are questions, and feel free to interrupt me. If not, we'll do the questions at the end.
Great.
So as Sarah said, I'm trained as a plant evolutionary biologist, and my work is really about, and once I was introduced to this field, I'm going to introduce you all to feminist science and technology studies, about trying to understand how science and the histories of science are located in particular cultural, social, historical moments. And so I'm really, my broad interest is, what does it mean to do experimental biology, knowing this history, knowing that larger cultural and historical contexts matter to biology? How should we be doing experimental biology? That's really at the heart of my research interests. And so this project is thinking about botany and the colonial roots of botany and what it would mean to decolonize botany. So very broadly, if you think of academia, it's broadly broken into these three broad, often these are colleges or broad areas: the natural sciences that study nature, social sciences that study society, and the humanities that study the products of society, so like art and theater, music. And so each of these is therefore defined by the object of their study, right? So it's all about what individuals study. And secondly, there are also methods with each of these. So they're shaped by both objects of study and methods of study. And of course, a field like women, gender, sexuality studies would put itself right in the center, in the intersection of those three. And the central argument of the field is that these are false divisions. And really, nature is all around us. Humans are part of nature. We have shaped nature. We continue to shape nature. And to be a good scientist, one needs to understand the historical context. We need to understand the relationship of nature and culture. And so that is really central to my work. And so rather than think of the world in these binary formations of nature and culture, science and society, we should understand the world as nature cultures. So for example, take a category like race. Race is not a stable category. It has changed considerably over time, depending on which part of the world you go to. There are different, the ways in which race plays out is very different. And even within the United States, there are groups that have shifted race. So if you take, there's a wonderful book of how the Irish became white, right? That they were not always considered white. And so these are mobile categories. Similarly, one could say that about gender or sexuality, and what we're going to talk about today, the idea of what the native and alien is. And so this is at the heart of my work, is that we need to understand that theories move between nature to culture, back to nature to culture, So we are constantly revising how we understand these different categories, and these categories change, change meaning, and therefore understanding them as nature cultures, recognize that these are co-constituted or co-produced always. And so when we think about colonialism, I really like, as a summary of what it is colonialism is about, is this quote by Leanne Simpson, who says, really what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is, how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And she answers, one, you use gender violence to remove indigenous peoples and their descendants from the land. Two, you remove agency from the plant and animal worlds. And three, you reposition land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. And indeed, if you look at the history of botany, it is deeply implicated in the histories of colonialism, of how to extract resources from particular parts of the world, bring it back, to the homeland. And so I'm going to do this in 3 parts, and first just tell you a little about what it meant growing up. I mean, I grew up in post-colonial India, but part of what post-colonial India was very much an extension of colonial India. So the medium of instruction of my schools were all English, and I studied the sciences. So India's post-independence, it really saw the future as a modern nation. And so science and technology was central to my education and central to the vision of the country. But yet when I was growing up, I grew up very much, and I think most people in India grew up in a world of stories. And there are especially the mythological stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are these grand epics. And in these epics, plants and animals are not lesser beings. They have properties, so there are ways in which plants and animals are very much alive and mobile and sentient and intelligent, and are very much in the plots of the story and carry the story through. And so I really grew up with that sense of what I'm calling enchantment or magic of the natural world. And that the natural world was something alive, something that was part of us. Each of the trees and plants around me were woven into these mythological worlds. And of course, when I went to school, I had to unlearn all of that. And pretty much my education said, those were stories, that was backward thinking, and now one needed to develop a scientific view of the world. And therefore we had to learn all the names in Latin, because that is what botanical nomenclature does. There's a wonderful author called Jamaica Kincaid, whose book, My Garden, is one I particularly love, and I highly recommend it. In another book, there is a character of hers called Lucy, who grew up in one of the Caribbean islands, and talks about how she's forced to study this poem, Daffodils, by William Wordsworth. And she talks about how, she says, in my child's mind's eye, the poem and its contents and the people through whom it came were repulsive. I had no rational or just way of arranging and separating the people who created the things to memorize from the people who made me memorize wonderful things, whether they be about daffodils, heaven, hell, or just the River Thames. And so really part of what she's describing, which was, I think, my experience as well, is that part of studying botany in school was a project of alienation. So suddenly the local words by which we knew the world around us was suddenly taken away, and now everything was in this alien tongue of Latin that one had to to understand. And in this other work called Lucy, the character finally sees a iridescent field of daffodils, and her response. Hold on. And so she says, I wanted to kill them. I wish that I had an enormous scythe. I would just walk down the path, dragging it along me, and I would cut these flowers down at the place where they emerged from the ground. So in part, it's capturing that very deep sense of alienation and anger at having to study things you never see outside. You are never going to witness your life. So much of our education were, British authors about albatrosses and daffodils. But this is what, the colonial legacy, the colonial afterlives, even in the post-colony looked like. And so it was this sense of alienation and this sense of schizophrenia in everyday life of what education was versus life outside. And as Kincaid says, this naming of things is so crucial to possession, a spiritual padlock with the key thrown irretrievably away, that it is a murder and erasing. This legacy of capturing and renaming nature leaves the post-colonial writer in the position of having to renegotiate the terms of taxonomy, struggling to articulate new relationship and new meanings in the tired language of empire. And so coming to, and so I want to tell you a little bit about this field I'm talking about, feminist science and technology studies. And really at the heart of it, I want to talk about objectivity and the politics of knowledge. So very broadly, that at least the view that I studied in school was picture A, that science was outside of culture, that somehow as scientists, when we entered our experimental site or the laboratory, that we were, as scientists, able to keep culture, historical contingency out the door, and somehow we were able to produce an objective view of the world, right? And this is something that Donna Haraway calls the God's trick, this idea that somehow scientists are outside of everything and they're looking down at the world and they can see things accurately, that they are not like other humans who are very much embedded within, within cultures and bring those cultural biases with them. And there's been a lot of work in the history of science showing this is not true, about the ways in which scientists interpreted the world very much within, historical and cultural contexts in which they live. So there was a time when, women were seen as not being rational beings, and therefore they should not be allowed, they have the right to vote, they should not be allowed into higher education. A very popular scientific theory at the time was that they should not be allowed into higher education because all the blood would go to their brains and there would not be any blood left for the uterus and they would become barren, shriveled creatures, right? These were scientific theories, because they were conducted in a historical context where this was the status of women. And in part, the feminist movement and women's movement that have changed those ideas of rights also have changed the ways in which scientists now talk about it, although the idea of sexual difference is very, very deep within science. We can talk more about that. So within feminist science and technology studies, we would say the way the world works is B, where science is within culture, and scientists are human beings very much embedded, within historical moments, and so we should see science as within culture. And so rather than pretending culture doesn't matter, rather than pretending we can be objective, we would be better scientists if we are reflexive about the work we do, where we ask questions of where do these theories come from? Where does this terminology come from? Why am I studying this? Why am I interpreting it this way? And there's a very well-known feminist philosopher called Sandra Harding, who talks about this idea called strong objectivity, the idea that more people from diverse viewpoints study the same problem, we are more likely to get a more robust truth. And that sort of opening up rather than pretending it doesn't exist, understanding the world as nature cultures and doing it deliberately will produce better science. And this is again another French philosopher, Bruno Latour, who I like the way he summarizes this, saying, part of what academia does is a work of purification. We have divided the world into non-human and human, nature and culture. And so we purify everything, right? So much of my education, all the things I'm going to tell you, I did not study in my botanical education. It is only post when I've been looking at the history of science that I've come to discover it so much, because we purify knowledge, and history and philosophy, questions of gender don't seem relevant to biology. Versus what he argues is we may do that, but all the while there are hybrids of nature and culture being produced in the world around us, right? And there's constantly a work of translation. And so part of the project of feminist science and technology is trying to reconcile these two and bring them in conversation with each other. So I'm going to talk about two case studies today. One talking about the idea of invasive species. And thinking with the figure of the migrant or refugee instead of the figure of the native. And so one of the books I've watched, if you're interested in hearing a more detailed discussion, is this book, Ghost Stories for Darwin, which came out in 2014. And part of the central argument I'm making there is that we have this idea of diversity or difference we talk about in culture, versus we talk about variation, natural variation, genetic variation within the sciences. And part of what I argue and demonstrate in that book is that these are related concepts. And indeed, if you look at all the key scientists, evolutionary biologists, population geneticists, they were very much in conversation between both of these, right? But because of this purified academy, we never study these two things together. And so centrally what they were wrestling with were questions of, what is a good society? Is it a society that is all Einsteins and Mozarts, only the brilliant people? And there were biologists who very much felt that that's the worldview they wanted, and people who had poorer biologies, poorer genetics should not be allowed to reproduce, right? Or we should curtail their reproduction. So this is the project of eugenics. Versus there were other group of scientists who said variation is key. Variation makes for stronger society. And we really want a society with lots of diverse people in it. So this was a biological argument, but it was also a political and social argument. And it's these histories that get cut off in the ways in which we teach biology, that these questions are often always connected in the history of science. And so part of the idea of invasion biology comes from the idea of native and foreign, and that nature is in place or nature out of place. And in the literature, you see it at a particular moment in early 19th century when someone was trying to someone called John Henslow was trying to categorize true British flora. So in naming what true British flora was, he also had to say what was not British flora. And that's the earliest we see this distinction of what belongs here and what is outside of here. And if you look at historians, and in particular Crosby and Richard Grove, what they argue is that if you really look at what it is colonialism did, it was an ecological project. It was really ecological imperialism, and we need to understand colonialism as an ecological project. And there was a time when we didn't have this idea of nature in place and out of place. So if you even 100 years ago, the USDA sent scientists across the world to look for interesting, curious, economically important, exotic looking plants and bring them back. So someone like David Fairchild himself brought 112,000 species into the country. Similarly, there was the American Acclimatization Society, and someone said, why not introduce every bird named Shakespeare's plays into New York Central Park? And so they did. right? So it's a very different moment than where we live. And so we need to, again, understand that our relationship to nature is very historically contingent. And the question becomes why? Why was there such a shift in the ways in we saw nature? And the answers people, that historians give is really, it is about immigration. And post-colonialism, the colonists came back and then built borders, right? And so again, very interestingly, the Human Exclusion Acts trying to keep foreign people out and keeping foreign plants and animals out happened. The human exclusion, Chinese, it was 1 year after plants and animals, right? So again, it's a very tight-knit history about the foreign in general, whatever species. And then, of course, with respect to immigration, with human immigration, you begin to see was a Chinese Exclusion Act and then a much larger immigration issue. So when we talk about invasive species, now it's a huge field. There are journals, every state has an invasive species list, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, right? All the environmental groups have a strong invasive species category. NSF funds invasive species research. And if you look at the definition of invasive species, is that they have to be introduced species. By definition, invasive species are foreign. If a native species takes off, it is not considered an invasive species. So here are some, sort of popular books with respect to invasive species. This is a children's book on exotic invaders infesting America. We start very young with this worldview. This idea of tinkering with Eden, this idea that in the past, there was an Eden, everything, was beautiful and got along with each other. And then these exotics came and became invasive and broke up this idyllic Eden. Again, the idea of wars and battle are very central to invasive species rhetoric. And as someone who's been tracking this over the last 2 decades, you really see the impact of 9/11, after which you see that, again, the rhetoric of war and invasion are very high. And as you see, and as we, about the invasive species being threats, and similarly about them being aliens, and again, the ways in which Homeland Security comes with respect to biosecurity, you see similarities. So within Homeland Security, it was you report anything suspicious, and now we have phone apps that if you see any plant or animal that is suspicious. So again, you see tracking the last 20 years that as language for foreign humans evolves, you see that shaping how we talk about foreign plants and animals. And at the center of the problem is really the borderless world, right? Is the idea of globalization. And that if we only created borders and kept the foreign out, then this will be a better society. So here are some titles from newspapers and magazines. Alien invasion, they're green, they're mean, and they may be taking over a park or preserve near you. Creepy strangler climbs Oregon's least wanted list. Biological invaders sweep in. Invasive species, pathogens of globalization. Again, what interests me is not a single of these titles tell you it's about a plant or animal, right? It's this classic generic fear of the outsider. And so whatever you're talking about, it's all talking about the foreign being bad. And as I looked at how we were talking about foreign humans and plant and animals, there were similarities across them. All foreign, they were unhygienic, diseased, damaged, threatening. Aliens are seen as other, they're visibly foreign, they're taking over everything, they're stealthily coming in and growing in number. And then this classic third world oversexed female, they're over reproducing, producing too many babies, and there's the fear of miscegenation. They're here to stay. There's irreversible change, and these are economically and ecologically destructive. And so again, how we talk about the foreign is very consistent across these. And what historians have shown is not just now, in the past too, every time we have this fear of immigration, you see this across species. You see germ panics. So you see panics of various kinds over a very generalized xenophobia. And this is my favorite, I think, headline: they came, they bred, they conquered, right? Which says it all. And post 9/11, as I was telling you, now we have these citizen sciences that are getting everyday citizens to become part of this project. We now have phone apps that you can take a picture of the species and send it to a particular number. And we have a militarized ecological group that we need to arm each other. We need green patriots, right? So as the ways in which we think about foreign humans has changed, we begin to see that in the ways in which we are talking about the natural world as well. And of course, in the United States in particular, it's very ironic because of who the native is, right? The native are not the Native Americans, it's the white settler colonialists who name themselves the natives. And so this question about what is native is really centrally a question, certainly with humans, but also with plants and animals. Is it something that was here 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? How do we decide what native is and what foreign is? What are the categories? And so when you dig deep here, you see how these are not easy. These are difficult, definitions. And ultimately, these are political definitions we make, right? We may agree to it as a scientific community that certain things will be seen as native or foreign, but the language we use is as though this is self-evident. And part of my argument here is not that there is no problem in the world, there's no ecosystem degradation, but it is about what we are blaming for the problem in the world. So repeatedly, there are both activists and scientists who name invasive species as the #1 ecological problem in the world, right? And so, and my argument is that there have certain invasive species the plant has been around for a long time. And the question becomes, why is it invasive now? Take something like kudzu. Kudzu was introduced in the World's Fair to the US. And at that time, they feared soil erosion. So the USDA paid farmers per hectare to plant kudzu, right? And then it eventually takes off. And now it's a terrible invasive species. But when we tell the story of these plants, we don't tell that history, right? It is about this foreign plant is terrible. We don't talk about the ways in which our own ecological understanding that we have facilitated many of these species to come here, to take root, and to spread. And so some of the central questions are really, for me, about development, about clear cutting, about the destruction of our ecosystems. And focusing on invasive species takes our eye out of these other deeper, harder problems. With changing climate, right? The question is, what is adapted to what environment anymore, given the changing climate in the world? We can talk more about this. So part of what I'm arguing is that this is a complex issue of why we come here. And it is the histories of colonialism that bring us here. It is that logic of extractive economy, that incessant focus on growth, as opposed to more sustainable ways of living. And that logic sees us through. But the discourse of invasive species has us all going out, pulling foreign species out and planting native species. And to me, that is an insufficient response to the ecological problems that face us. So I want to, so here I think part of the argument I was trying to make is that as we think about global warming, we already know that species are moving northwards, they're changing their ranges because of climate change. And there's a way in which we need to think with these changing ecologies. We need different ecological models rather than one of the native. So I'm going to briefly talk about, in the histories of colonialism, talking about the sexual lives of plants. And so this is Londa Schiebinger wonderful book called Nature's Body. And she opens the book with hermaphroditic plants castrated by natural mothers, trees and shrubs clothed in wedding gowns, flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride. Are these the memoirs of an 18th century Academy of Science or tales from the boudoir? And part of what she argues that it is both. And what she argues in looking at the history of plant naming, and in particular the history of Linnaeus, is that he emerges at a time where the 18th century saw botanists' classification of plants shift from a more local form of useful knowledge to a scientific classification that was both abstract and universal. And in part, this classification of abstract and universal was necessary because of colonialism, so that when colonists went to one country and went to another country, they wanted to be able to identify the plants. They wanted to be able to say whether these were the same plants. They wanted to be able to share knowledge of, where they found what, for which you needed a common naming system. And in part, this takes off, because of the needs of colonialism. And what Schiebinger argues is that the scientization of botany coincided with an ardent sexualization of plants. The scientific revolution and the revolution of sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus of botany. And Linnaeus grounded, as I'll talk about in a second, grounded his naming system on the sexual life of plants. And part of what she's arguing is that when he sexed plants, they actually became human. And his whole key to nomenclature, was the key to the sexual system, was based on the nuptiae plantarum, or the marriage of plants. And so Linnaeus very clearly named male parts and female parts. The male parts were completely corresponding with humans in terms of there was an equivalent to the filament, there was an equivalent to the pollen, there was an equivalent to the anthers, and similarly, a correspondence with the female parts as well. And he classified plants based on the number of so-called male and female parts they had. So it was one husband, two wives, five wives, two husbands, right? So it was all about the marriage of plants within the nuptial bed that he was talking about. And in fact, this, when his work emerged, it scandalized a lot of people who saw this as lewd and very pornographic. And in fact, this puts a lot of women botanists in a difficult position because they were seen as that they should not be exposed to this. So it affects women in botany as well, this classification system. And so, so he talks about, andrecious, gynoecious. So, and part of the point I'm trying to make here is that with respect to humans, we can talk about whether we should be doing that or not. We have a binary system of sex and gender, but in imposing this on plants, plants on the other hand have extraordinary variation. And in order to accommodate this variation, we have had to come up with lots of new terminology, right? Where they only have male flowers, they only have female flowers, androdioecious, having male flowers on some plants, bisexual ones on others, gynodioecious, they have hermaphroditic plants and female flowers on the same plants, androgynomonoecious, they have male, female, and bisexual flowers on the same plant, andromonoecious, gynomonoecious, polygamodioecious, polygamomonoecious, subdioecious, subgynoecious, trimonoecious, and this goes on and on. And so the point I'm trying to make here is this is a kind of anthropomorphic move that Linnaeus does in taking certain Western binary sexuality onto plants. And as a result, we have had to create this really complicated set of vocabulary. And so in part, this makes me ask, are there other ways in which we could look at the world, which is not looking through these eyes of puritanical sexuality? And in fact, these categories that he created, the classification of organisms, as Dobzhansky argues, lives on today, and the subdivisions of animal and plant with Linnaeus, except for some exceptions where things have moved because of molecular phylogenies, we still use this terminology. So those histories, colonial histories, live on in the ways in which we talk about plant reproductive biology. And so in thinking about these histories, as Leanne Simpson talks about in the beginning, the question is really, what is the human, right? Who is the us? Who is the we? And when we talk about the Anthropocene, we talk about, these are what humans have done to the world. But if you look at the history of colonialism, it is all humans have not done this to the world, right? Some humans colonized other humans, took away resources, brought them back, built borders, and keep outsiders out through laws of various kinds. And then now the question becomes, with climate change, that the solution has to be equally borne by all the world. And this is one of the central sticking points in a lot of these world discussions. And so again, we need to be more nuanced in the ways in which we understand the Anthropocene, in the sense of how have the history shaped climate change, shaped what we are calling the Anthropocene, and the tremendous damage that we have done to the world. And part of what the language of empire gives us is this abstract universal language. And in fact, there's this whole field of ethnobotany where people study the different understandings of plant life across the world and relationships of different peoples with their plants. And there are people who would argue, is botany and a colonial ethnoscience, right? Is it any better? Is it better? Is it producing better knowledge than the knowledge that people have sometimes gathered for hundreds of years? And in fact, so much of pharmaceuticals, when you look at their history, has been about looking at these ethnobotanical knowledge and then finding the active ingredient in that particular plant and then patenting that. Again, part of what botany does, like all of academic knowledge, is it separates the object of knowledge from the context and the histories of what it's going. So there's a vivisection of knowledge. And part of this disciplinary specialization was very important because it was a technology of extraction. And part of what we do in the academy is we train our students with the ways in which we were trained, right? So we carry on these silos that we have created. And again, in understanding the history of empire as fundamentally an ecological project, and the ways in which a Eurocentric view became the central focus in the ways in which academic knowledge has been constructed, when in fact, colonial conceptions are very much shaped by gender, race, and class, the ways in which they viewed different parts of the world. And so we need to understand that this is a very complicated, very contextual histories, and that these extractive economies that began through histories of colonialism, through the spice trade, the lumber trade, through the plantations across the world, through the histories of slavery, continue to shape both botany today and modern science today. So I think I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions or.
Thank you so much. I have so much to think about, and I think I told you when we first started, before we started with everyone, that I'm like, I do study invasive species, and so I'm gonna first of all, everyone who has questions, comments, wants to start a conversation. It doesn't have to be a direct question. I'm thinking this is a great group to have kind of, put out thoughts that we'd like a conversation about. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, whichever is fine. But I am really interested to hear exploring that language of non-native species. And I don't even know what the right term is to use now. I know when I was in graduate school, we talked a lot about Elton and the use of militaristic language and trying to get away from that. But I really see what you're saying about that. The more, it's a construct of putting up the terminology. But then how do you have advice or ways for us to think about it? And I say us, like those of us in conservation that are managing land, on Nantucket, it's an island. We do have some very fragile habitats where there's species that don't occur anywhere else because they were extirpated. And it is all that human base, right? That human problem. But do you have any advice for how we talk about it, whether as educators, as conservationists, and that kind of thing?
I'm spacing on his name. So there are, lots of biologists who've been thinking about this. And so, for example, there was a proposal he teaches at Macalester, Mark, I'm spacing on his name. And so part of what they argue is that not every foreign species is going to become invasive, that there are certain life history characteristics that plants have. There are cases where native species have also become a menace, right? So rather than just saying this is a problem with exotics or foreign species, to look at these life history characteristics, so make an ecological argument of what might likely become invasive and focus on that rather than this is about foreignness, right? That is, at the heart of it, of the ways in which it shapes the larger xenophobic climate we live in. To me, it's also about telling more complex stories about invasive species, about in cases where it is humans that brought it, or it was or the Asian longhorn beetle. It's a story about, the wood that when globalization happened and they needed all these crates, it was the wood from China that sent it around, right? So to tell these complex stories of why this happened, it's not these, foreign species just wanting to, that they just came, they're evil. I mean, the kind of language we call them, evil beauties. I mean, it's really, some of it is very violent and very vicious. And it's just this thing about them being foreign. So I think if we told more complex stories and also implicated poor ecological management or these ideas that very often it's like, oh, this is a problem. Oh, let's just do this. Like, let's bring this insect here and it will eat this pest. And of course it eats this pest and then does something else. How many stories do we have across the world where it is that hubris of it's that this immediate problem we're going to solve, but then we forget that ecologies are very entangled with each other, and sometimes there are these unintended consequences. So I think if we, told these nature cultural stories of how things came to be, of, for example, why Asian carp is a problem here versus in China, people eat it and it's overfished. You can't get Asian carp there. But here it has taken over. And so now I hear they're freezing it here and sending it to China. Right? And we live in a globalized world where these things are all connected with each other. So I just think we need more complex accounts in the ways in which we educate ourselves and each other. And I think that's, so I think that's at the heart of the problem. I am very, I think we have done tremendous damage to the natural world. We need urgent action. I'm all with that, but the ways in which this gets framed, I think is troubling.
I think one of the ways that I remember in graduate school when I was working in an invasive species lab was we had a conference that was a meeting with partners where our, New England invasive species are prevalent. A lot of them come from East Asia, right? And so we had Japanese and Chinese representatives, scientists that came to UConn. We had a talk, and then we learned about the species that are highly invasive there that come from us. So like my favorite example that I do tell this story is about goldenrods, right? We love our native goldenrods. We have like 14 different species on Nantucket. We talk about how beautiful they are. In parts of China, they're very invasive and they invade a lot of the grasslands. So you can think about that same language they're using about a plant that we care about and vice versa. So it kind of, you put yourself in that.
I think that's an excellent point. But, this nativism is across the world, right? So it's doing the same work in all different places. And, that's also troubling. The other point for me is really about, given climate change, it's not clear to me, it seems we need a different language. And I mean, ecologists, I'm not the first one saying, a lot of ecologists are, figuring out ways in which, how do we create migration corridors, or how do we facilitate this? And so I sort of feel that this is also a rather retro framework, and the other part that often gets, I think, forgotten in the ways in which we talk about invasive and native species is the importance of the soil community. That native species don't grow by themselves. They're growing in a community, sort of in the soil. The mycorrhiza in the soil are important. There are all kinds of feedback loops, in the soil. And so also paying attention to those larger frameworks than this species by itself.
I think that's a really good point. We do have a question, but I just wanted to follow up with one thing, because, even me talking to you about this, I'm not, thinking of the right language to use and trying to change that framework, because that's the language that's like the go-to, right, of what we learned and what we were trained as scientists. And I really appreciated what you said about we travel with our own silos, or we reteach those silos. So I really appreciate that. We have a question from Jeff Clayton said, what do we do about the naming of species so that it is more inclusive, but that scientists still know what species we're talking about when you write an article?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are people groups who have been working on this. And some of it is that the naming of the species is often, at one time it was some white explorer who went to, and so his name is all over that. Now in modern cases, it's some famous, sports person, or I think Lady Gaga has someone named after her. But I also wonder, whether we can think about being multilingual, just as we are multilingual with languages, can we also learn to become multilingual botanically, right? So that people are also learning local names. And I think this is, I think one of the reasons why so many of us are alienated from the world around, that very often the common names describe the plant, right? Something looks like a buttercup, or something is a yellow, they are blue something. They describe what we see, but these Latin names really have no context to it. And I wonder if we also promoted local names, whether, especially kids will relate to the natural world. They'll be able to name more things around it. So I think there's something very alienating in this, botanical nomenclature. I think scientists do different kind of work, but I don't know if this has to become as universal as it has. But I know there have been people working on this, and who have different kinds of solutions.
So there's two questions that are related about Guthrie. Loved your presentation. It was very fascinating. and was interested in, you referenced several books. Is there a way that we could get, there was one question about getting a general list of some of the books that you mentioned. And then Guthrie also asked specifically, is there one or two that you would recommend to learn more about botany's colonial roots?
So the Alfred Crosby, the Crosby Ecological Imperialism, and then Green Imperialism by Richard Grove. And part of what Richard Grove does in that book is says conservation biology comes from colonialism, because the colonists are saying, we're cutting down everything. We will, what will be left here? So we need to find a way to cut it in a way that we can keep extracting, right? So these are really the roots of where conservation biology comes from. Those two books are really good. In terms of, if you wanted more on the argument I'm making about invasive species, there's a third of Ghost Stories for Darwin is about that. Londa Scheibinger's Nature's Body. And she also has a book on colonial botany. That is, it's a collection that's really good.
Thank you. I know that I will confess I screenshot a few places where you had some reference books that I was very interested in. So I can share some of those with Guthrie too, because I do know her. So
and I'm hoping to finish this book in the next few months. So I'll be sure to send you a link once I'm done. That'll have wonderful. A much longer bibliography.
Great, wonderful, thank you.
About the plant reproductive, that's a great question, Chase. I don't know of anybody who has done that, but it's an intriguing, and it's something I'm working on. We'll see how far I get.
We have another question in the chat that is asking you about, can you speak a little bit about your work in teaching at UMass? I wish I had a professor or class that has incorporated this into my education, and think all ecology, life science programs would really benefit from these concepts. That's a great question. Indeed,
but this is a real problem, right? Very often in biology, it's like, so in every field, we call it the canon, where the field says, you have to cover this and this and this and this. If not, you're not a proper, whatever, sociologist or biologist. And in the sciences, this is a perennial issue where they say, we can't add one more course, what will we give up? I can't, so I can't add another day talking about this, because then I have to give up something else. And so I think at some point it has to be the will of the field that they incorporate it. There is so much interest among students, especially graduate students and undergraduate students. So I've spoken in several graduate classes where they are just making up courses on their own. Yeah. So none of their biology faculty are trained to do this. So they have just petitioned the department, they've created a course, and they just invite people to come and speak. They're reading by themselves. So I think at best students get this through general education courses. And very often it is, they get to it very late. And, but I really do think there is a lot of interest out there. So I'm hoping that biology curriculums would incorporate it, right? So that we can, it's not that we can change this overnight. You still have to write your dissertation and your scientific papers with the tradition, but at least we start thinking about what the problems might be and find ways to, change the language and the frameworks by which we talk about it. I think that's really important. I think one of the things I was thinking about during your talk was how we talk about, like you said, climate refugees, right? Both obviously people, but our plants and animals, and as they're changing their distributions. And so we've had general conversations about that on Nantucket, because being an island, we would have to have that facilitated migration for plants. And the same principles of ecology, of the founder, like of species movement, we use negative language when we talk about it with a species we don't want, right? But the same exact process is what's taking place with species that we care about, but they need to move as the climate changes. And so it's like you feel yourself being contradictory. And so it's really interesting thinking that through about the language you're using for the same processes. And the point you're making, I think, is a really important one when you were saying how we communicate it, is that if we said, this is the world we want, these are the then I think we are acknowledging that these are constructed worlds.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, because this is useful, or this existed here 100 years ago, or this plant feeds this particular, this particular butterfly, or,
Mhm.
and there are many instances in the world where a so-called invasive species or a foreign species, now a native butterfly, is reliant on it. And then the question becomes, what do we do, in those kinds of cases?
Mhm.
But if we, part of the language of native and foreign really makes it seem that, nature is fixed. These are native, these are foreign, this is the way the world should be. And so taking away some of that for opening up that, evolution is changing all the time. Ecologies transform all the time. But there's something about what humans have done, that has speeded it all up.
I'm thinking now about how that justification of how we manage the landscape even, or, we put favorites on certain species, but even just acknowledging that it's a construct, right? Like that we're saying we're managing for this, not because it existed like this 100 years ago. It's because of all these different reasons. And that's just, but like, kind of owning it, I guess,
Yeah,
in a way.
exactly.
Yeah, is a first step. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so useful and interesting, and I feel like I have a lot of thinking and reading to do myself. Are there any other chats or questions? These have been great, and I feel like I feel like my brain is churning on this. All right, well, thank you again so much, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. We will be processing the recording and posting it soon, and I will be sharing it with everyone that registered. So that's another way to get some of the books that Dr. Subramaniam mentioned in the talk. So thank you again so much for being here tonight. This was really, really
Bye-bye.
impressive. Okay, bye.